If you could achieve everything you wanted for your country, what price would you be willing to pay? James K. Polk answered that question with his own life and the nation's peace. In his ambitious 4-year term, during his presidency, the United States annexed Texas, wrested California through the war with Mexico, and for the first time stretched unbroken to the Pacific Ocean. But the price of manifest destiny was brutal. Only 3 months after stepping down, Polk fell victim to a deadly cholera outbreak, his health already shattered by years of relentless work. And the vast lands he added to the Union reignited the nation's fiercest debate whether slavery would spread west, and that bitter fight lit the fuse of the Civil War. Polk was born in 1795 in a log cabin on the North Carolina frontier at a time when America was young and uncertain. His Scots-Irish blood gave his family a spirit of self-reliance, iron discipline, and deep piety. Raised between two currents, the worldly ambition of his father and the severe faith of his mother, Polk was forged with an unwavering resolve, a quality that would both make history and seal his tragic fate. From his earliest years, young James was set apart not by talent or temperament, but by a persistent and agonizing malady. He was a frail and sickly child, plagued by a mysterious and debilitating abdominal pain. In a culture that prized physical strength and endurance, where a boy's worth was measured by his ability to contribute to the back-breaking labor of the farm, James was an invalid. He could not clear fields, split rails, or follow the plow alongside his father and younger brothers. This was a source of deep frustration for the energetic Samuel, and a cause for constant prayerful concern for Jane. For James himself, it must have been a deeply isolating experience, marking him as different, as somehow lesser, in the rough-hewn world of the frontier. The source of his torment was bladder stones, a hideously painful condition in an age without painkillers or effective remedies. For over a decade, he lived in a state of chronic, often excruciating pain. His world was circumscribed by this ailment, his future shrouded in uncertainty. While other boys were growing strong and learning the skills of the land, James was often confined indoors, his energy sapped, his body a source of constant betrayal. It's not hard to imagine that this period of forced inactivity turned his focus inward, sharpening his mind and observational skills, compelling him to find a different path to prove his worth. In 1806, when James was 11, Samuel Polk, ever the opportunist, decided to move the family west. He sold the North Carolina farm and led his growing family on the arduous trek across the Appalachian Mountains to the fertile lands of the Duck River Valley in Tennessee. This was the true frontier, a region recently opened to settlement, a place of staggering beauty and unforgiving harshness. The journey itself was a brutal test of endurance. For hundreds of miles, the family would have traveled by wagon and on foot, following crude trails that were little more than muddy tracks carved through dense primeval forests. They would have forded swift-flowing rivers, navigated treacherous mountain passes, and lived with the constant threat of disease and accident. For the frail, pain-riddled James, this journey must have been an almost unimaginable ordeal. Every jolt of the wagon sending waves of agony through his small body. Tennessee, however, would be the making of him. The family prospered, Samuel's shrewd land deals paying off handsomely. But as James entered his teenage years, his condition worsened, the pain becoming a constant, unbearable presence. At 17, Polk underwent a brutal bladder stone operation in Kentucky, likely under the hand of Dr. Ephraim McDowell or one of his protégés, without the mercy of anesthesia. The year is significant. This was long before the discovery of anesthesia. There was no ether, no chloroform, nothing to dull the senses. The surgical toolkit consisted of sharpened knives, probes, and forceps. The only palliative offered to the patient was a shot of brandy to fortify the nerves and a leather strap to bite down on to stifle the screams. The 17-year-old Polk, fully and terrifyingly conscious, was placed on a simple wooden table. He was likely held down by several strong assistants as Dr. McDowell began the procedure, a lithotomy. An incision was made, and the surgeon, working by feel as much as by sight, would have inserted his instruments to locate, grasp, and forcibly extract the stones from the boy's bladder. We can only imagine the horror of that experience, the searing pain, the violation, the sounds, the smells of the operating room. It was a trial by fire, a form of legalized torture that must have felt like an eternity. The fact that Polk survived is nothing short of miraculous, a testament to his own extraordinary resilience, his will to live, and the undeniable skill of Dr. McDowell. The surgery was a success in that it removed the source of his lifelong agony, but the physical and psychological scars would last a lifetime. The procedure left him sterile, a private sorrow that he and his wife Sarah would carry throughout their marriage. More profoundly, it seemed to burn away any trace of youthful frivolity, leaving behind a core of hardened steel. He had faced the abyss and endured. He had learned to master pain, to suppress his emotions, and to focus his entire being on the task of survival. This grim, stoic discipline, forged in the crucible of that Kentucky operating room, would become the defining characteristic of his political career. Freed from the prison of his own body, Polk's life began anew. The path of a farmer was now permanently closed to him, but another, more promising one was opening up. His intellect, long sharpened by years of quiet observation and reading, could now be fully cultivated. He had a ravenous appetite for knowledge. His father, ever practical, had initially tried to place him in a local business, but James, who had spent his life in physical torment, had no patience for the mundane world of ledgers and merchandise. He yearned for a classical education, the traditional pathway to the learned professions of law, medicine, and the ministry. He pleaded his case to his father with the same quiet intensity that would later characterize his political dealings. Samuel, perhaps recognizing that his son's iron will now match his own, finally relented. At the age of 18, an age when most young men of his class were already finishing their studies, James Polk began his formal education. He enrolled in a Presbyterian academy, where he immediately distinguished himself with his diligence and quick mind. He was making up for lost time, and he attacked his studies with a relentless, almost desperate energy. In 1816, he entered the University of North Carolina as a sophomore, a testament to the progress he had made in just 2 years. Chapel Hill was a world away from the rough-hewn frontier of Tennessee. It was a center of classical learning, a place where the sons of the Southern elite were groomed for leadership. Polk, however, was not there to cultivate social graces. He was a man possessed by a singular, all-consuming ambition to excel. He lived a Spartan existence, his days and nights governed by a rigid schedule of study. He often rose before dawn and worked by candlelight long after the rest of the campus was dark and silent. He mastered Latin, Greek, and mathematics, his logical and methodical mind, finding a natural home in the structured disciplines of the classical curriculum. He became the undisputed star of the university's debating society, the Dialectic Society, where he honed the rhetorical skills that would serve him so well in the political arena. His speeches were noted not for their soaring eloquence, but for their logical force, their meticulous preparation, and their irrefutable command of the facts. His fellow students regarded him with a mixture of awe and puzzlement. They respected his intellect and his discipline, but they also saw him as intensely serious, almost unnervingly so. One classmate later recalled he was temperate, prudent, and exemplary in his deportment. Another noted that his defining trait was a deep, abiding, and never to be satisfied ambition. He graduated in 1818 after only 2.5 years, with first honors in both classics and mathematics. The sickly, unpromising boy from the North Carolina backcountry had, through sheer force of will, transformed himself into a scholar of the first rank. But for Polk, academia was never the end goal. It was merely the training ground. His sights were set firmly on a career in law and politics. He returned to Tennessee, a state that was rapidly becoming a center of political power in the young republic, and began to read law in the Nashville office of Felix Grundy. This was a pivotal choice. Grundy was a legal and political giant, a former congressman, a brilliant criminal defense attorney, and a master of the rough-and-tumble art of frontier politics. He was a key figure in the emerging political faction that was coalescing around another Tennessee hero, the formidable General Andrew Jackson. Under Grundy's tutelage, Polk received an education that no university could provide. He learned not just the letter of the law, but the practical application of it in the courtroom and the back rooms where political deals were made. He learned how to build a case, how to sway a jury, and how to navigate the complex web of alliances and rivalries that defined the political landscape. He was admitted to the Tennessee bar in 1820 and, with Grundy's help, quickly built a thriving legal practice. His success was, once again, built on the foundation of meticulous preparation and relentless hard work. While other lawyers relied on charm and oratorical flair, Polk won his cases through exhaustive research and airtight logic. It was in this period, as his professional life was taking off, that his personal life was also transformed. Through his political and social connections in the bustling town of Murfreesboro, he was introduced to a young woman named Sarah Childress. Sarah was not a typical frontier belle. She was the daughter of a wealthy planter and land speculator, and she had received an education far superior to that of most women of her time, having attended the exclusive Moravian Female Academy in Salem, North Carolina. She was intelligent, poised, well-read, and possessed of a keen political mind. She was also deeply ambitious, not for herself in a public sense. The conventions of the era made that impossible, but for the men in her life. Their courtship was a meeting of minds as much as hearts. In James, Sarah saw a man of immense talent and discipline, a man destined for greatness. In Sarah, James found not just a wife, but a true partner, someone who understood his ambition and shared his vision. They were married on New Year's Day, 1824. This union would become one of the most formidable political partnerships in American history. Sarah was, in every sense, his co-pilot. She was his confidant, his strategist, his social emissary, and his most trusted advisor. She managed his finances, oversaw his household and plantations, and curated his public image. James was often described as cold, stiff, and socially awkward. Sarah was his warm, engaging, and charming counterpart. She read all the major newspapers, kept abreast of the political gossip, and offered him shrewd, insightful counsel on strategy and personnel. She was, as one historian noted, his window on the world. Their inability to have children, a consequence of his childhood surgery, was a shared private sadness, but it also seemed to bind them even closer together, allowing them to pour all their formidable energies into their shared political project, the advancement of James K. Polk. With his successful law practice and his new well-connected wife by his side, Polk's entry into the political arena was all but inevitable. He had already become a prominent member of the Tennessee State Militia, rising to the rank of colonel, a title that, while largely ceremonial, was an important credential for an aspiring politician. But his true political allegiance lay with the man who was rapidly becoming the voice of the American frontier, Andrew Jackson. Jackson, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, was in the process of building a new political movement, one that challenged the established order and championed the cause of the common man against the perceived corruption of the Eastern financial and political elites. Polk saw in Jackson the embodiment of his own values, a fierce patriotism, a distrust of centralized power, and an unshakable belief in the destiny of the American Republic to expand westward. In 1823, Polk ran for and was elected to the Tennessee State Legislature. He immediately distinguished himself as a tireless and effective legislator. He was not one for empty rhetoric. He was a workhorse who immersed himself in the dull but necessary business of drafting bills, studying budgets, and mastering parliamentary procedure. His crowning achievement during his single term was to steer through the legislature the election of his hero, Andrew Jackson, to the United States Senate. This act cemented his reputation as a loyal and capable Jacksonian lieutenant. He had proven his worth on the state level. Now, with the encouragement of Jackson and the unwavering support of Sarah, he set his sights on a much larger stage. In 1825, he ran for the United States House of Representatives. He won a decisive victory, and at the age of 30, Colonel James K. Polk, the man who had overcome a debilitating illness and a late start in life through sheer, unadulterated willpower, prepared to leave for Washington, D.C. He was stepping into a cauldron of political intrigue and partisan fury, a world that would test his skills, his principles, and his endurance to their very limits. The quiet, methodical man from Tennessee was on his way, and the nation would never be the same. When Congressman James K. Polk first rode into Washington, D.C. in the autumn of 1825, he did not find a majestic, marble-clad capital. The city that would one day become a symbol of global power was, at that time, little more than a sprawling, muddy, and ambitious village carved out of a swamp. Grand, half-finished public buildings like the Capitol and the White House stood like lonely monuments in a landscape of unpaved roads, simple boarding houses, and raucous taverns. Pigs roamed freely through the streets, which turned into impassable quagmires after a hard rain. The city's humid air was thick with the scent of wood smoke, livestock, and the simmering political intrigue that was its chief industry. It was a place of stark contrasts, of soaring democratic ideals and grubby backroom deal-making, of formal presidential levees and bare-knuckle political brawls. The political atmosphere was even more turbulent than the city's unpaved streets. The genteel, deferential politics of the founding generation had given way to a new, ferocious brand of partisan warfare. The presidential election of 1824 had been a national trauma. 4 candidates had fractured the vote, throwing the decision into the House of Representatives. There, in what Andrew Jackson's supporters would forever decry as the corrupt bargain, Henry Clay, the influential Speaker of the House, threw his support behind John Quincy Adams, who was then appointed Secretary of State in the new administration. Jackson, the hero of New Orleans and the winner of the popular vote, was denied the presidency. The outrage was seismic, cleaving the political landscape in two and giving birth to a new political party, the Democrats, a populist movement built around the magnetic personality of Jackson and fueled by a burning sense of grievance. Into this maelstrom of anger and accusation stepped the 30-year-old freshman congressman from Tennessee. James K. Polk was an unknown quantity in the Capitol, a man from the western frontier with a quiet demeanor and a serious, unsmiling face. But he was not without a compass. He knew exactly where he stood. He was a Jackson man, through and through. He viewed the Adams administration not just as a political opponent, but as an illegitimate government, the product of a stolen election and the embodiment of everything he and his constituents despised. Adams represented the old guard, the Northeastern intellectual elite, who advocated for a strong activist federal government, a government that would fund national universities, build observatories, and finance a vast network of roads and canals. To Polk, this was heresy. It was the dangerous centralizing philosophy of Alexander Hamilton reborn, a betrayal of the Jeffersonian ideal of a simple agrarian republic with a strictly limited government. From the moment he took his seat, Polk became a foot soldier in the Jacksonian War against the Adams administration. But he was a peculiar kind of soldier. In an era that lionized the great orator, men like Daniel Webster, whose booming voice and grandiloquent speeches could hold the Senate in thrall, or Henry Clay, whose charm and eloquence were the stuff of legend, Polk's style was deliberately, almost aggressively plain. He possessed none of their theatrical flair. His voice was serviceable but not commanding. His speeches were not adorned with soaring poetry or clever anecdotes. Instead, he armed himself with a weapon that his more flamboyant colleagues often neglected: facts. Polk's capacity for work was legendary. He transformed himself into a master of the mundane but essential machinery of government. He would spend endless hours in the Library of Congress, his head bent over dense government reports, budget ledgers, and trade summaries. He became an expert on tariffs, public land policy, and the national debt. When he rose to speak on the House floor, he did so not as a poet, but as a prosecutor. He would build his case brick by methodical brick, laying out a relentless barrage of facts, figures, and constitutional arguments. He would systematically dissect the administration's proposals, exposing what he saw as their profligacy, their inefficiency, and their unconstitutional overreach. His attacks were not flashy, but they were devastatingly effective, earning him the nickname Young Hickory, a clear nod to his mentor, Old Hickory, Andrew Jackson. He was a younger, more refined, but no less tough version of the general himself. His loyalty and effectiveness were not lost on the Jacksonian leadership. He became a key member of the opposition, a reliable and indefatigable voice against the Adams agenda. For 4 long years, he and his fellow Jacksonians waged a campaign of relentless obstruction, determined to make Adams a one-term president and to clear the way for their hero's triumphant return. The election of 1828 was one of the dirtiest and most vicious in American history, a campaign of slander and personal attacks. But when the dust settled, the result was a political earthquake. Andrew Jackson won in a landslide, a victory that was hailed by his supporters as a revolution, a triumph of the common man over the corrupt elite. With Jackson in the White House, Polk's status skyrocketed. He was no longer a mere opposition backbencher. He was now a key lieutenant for the President of the United States, his administration's point man in the House of Representatives. Jackson, a man who valued loyalty above all else, saw in Polk a kindred spirit, a man of unwavering principles and unshakable resolve. He entrusted Polk with the monumental task of steering his radical and often controversial agenda through the treacherous currents of Congress. It was during this period from 1829 to 1837 that Polk truly came into his own, involving himself in the 3 great political battles that defined the Jacksonian era: the War on the National Bank, the Nullification Crisis, and the tragic policy of Indian removal. The Bank War was the central defining conflict of Jackson's presidency. The Second Bank of the United States was a powerful quasi-private institution that functioned as the federal government's fiscal agent. To its supporters like Henry Clay and the newly formed Whig Party, the bank was an essential instrument of economic stability and national prosperity. To Jackson and his followers, it was a monster, a corrupt and unconstitutional monopoly that served the interests of a wealthy, northeastern financial elite at the expense of the farmers and mechanics of the South and West. Jackson was convinced that the bank, under its brilliant and politically savvy president Nicholas Biddle, was using its immense financial power to bribe politicians and manipulate the economy. He saw it as a threat to American liberty, and he vowed to destroy it. Polk was chosen to lead the charge. He was made chairman of the powerful House Ways and Means Committee, the committee that oversees all matters of taxation and finance. From this influential perch, he became the administration's chief inquisitor. In 1832, when Biddle and his allies in Congress pushed for an early recharter of the bank, Polk was ready. He launched a congressional investigation, producing a majority report that, while light on concrete evidence of corruption, was a masterful piece of political propaganda, accusing the bank of a litany of abuses. When the recharter bill passed Congress, Jackson issued one of the most famous and consequential vetoes in American history, a fiery populist manifesto that Polk had helped to draft. The subsequent presidential election became a referendum on the bank, and Jackson won another resounding victory. But the war was not over. Jackson, believing he now had a mandate from the people, decided to remove the federal government's deposits from the bank, a move of questionable legality that sent shockwaves through the financial system. The Senate, controlled by the Whigs, passed a motion of censure against the president. The political battle reached a fever pitch. Through it all, Polk was Jackson's unwavering defender in the House. He endured a relentless torrent of abuse from the opposition, who labeled him a sycophant, a miserable tool of the executive. But Polk was unflappable. He worked tirelessly, day and night, to rally the Democratic forces, delivering speech after speech defending the president's actions. He eventually succeeded in getting the House to pass resolutions supporting the removal of the deposits, and in a final act of loyalty, spent years fighting to have the Senate's censure of Jackson expunged from the official record, a symbolic victory he finally achieved in the closing days of Jackson's presidency. The bank war was a brutal, scarring affair, but it cemented Polk's reputation as a man of principle and a masterful political tactician. While the bank war was a battle over economic philosophy, the nullification crisis was a struggle for the very soul of the nation. The crisis was precipitated by a series of federal tariffs that were designed to protect the nascent manufacturing industries of the North, but which had the effect of raising the price of imported goods for the agrarian South. South Carolina, led by the brilliant but radical political theorist John C. Calhoun, declared the tariffs of 1828 and 1832 to be unconstitutional and therefore null and void within its borders. The state threatened to secede from the Union if the federal government attempted to collect the duties by force. It was the most serious challenge to federal authority since the nation's founding, a direct precursor to the secession crisis that would erupt 3 decades later. This crisis placed Polk in a difficult position. As a Southerner and a staunch advocate for states' rights, he was sympathetic to the economic grievances of his region. He believed the tariff of abominations was unjust and economically harmful. However, he was, above all, a Unionist. He believed that the doctrine of nullification was a constitutional absurdity and that secession was treason. He drew a hard line between legitimate opposition to federal policy and a direct challenge to the integrity of the Union. He stood shoulder to shoulder with President Jackson, who responded to South Carolina's defiance with a thunderous proclamation, famously declaring, "Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you really ready to incur its guilt?" Behind the scenes, Polk played a crucial role in navigating the crisis. While he publicly supported Jackson's force bill, which authorized the president to use military force to ensure the collection of the tariff, he also worked tirelessly with moderates in Congress to find a political solution. He understood that a military confrontation would be a catastrophe, and he threw his support behind a compromise tariff, crafted by his great rival Henry Clay, that would gradually lower the duties over a period of years. The compromise worked. South Carolina accepted the new tariff and rescinded its ordinance of nullification, and the nation stepped back from the brink of civil war. For Polk, it was a defining moment, a lesson in the delicate art of balancing principle with pragmatism, and a reaffirmation of his core belief that the preservation of the Union was the highest political virtue. The third great and most morally troubling pillar of the Jacksonian agenda was the policy of Indian removal. From the earliest days of the Republic, the relationship between the United States and the Native American tribes had been fraught with conflict and broken promises. By the 1820s, the so-called five civilized tribes, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole, occupied vast tracts of valuable land in the southeastern states, lands that were coveted by white settlers and cotton planters. Despite the fact that these tribes had adopted many aspects of American culture, including constitutional governments, written languages, and settled agriculture, the states of Georgia, Alabama, and Mississippi were determined to dispossess them. Andrew Jackson, a veteran of numerous campaigns against Native American tribes, made their removal a central plank of his platform. In 1830, with Polk's staunch support, Congress passed the Indian Removal Act, which authorized the president to negotiate treaties to exchange their eastern lands for territory west of the Mississippi River. The policy was presented as a benevolent one, an effort to protect the tribes from the corrupting influence of white society. The reality was far more brutal. The negotiations were often conducted under duress, and when the tribes resisted, as the Cherokee did by taking their case all the way to the Supreme Court and winning only to be defied by Jackson, they were ultimately removed by force. Polk was a consistent and unapologetic supporter of this policy. Throughout his time in the House, he voted for the necessary appropriations and legislation to carry it out. He saw it not as a moral issue, but as a practical one. In his view, the tribes were an obstacle to progress, to the inevitable, and in his mind, divinely ordained westward expansion of the United States. His position was tragically the mainstream view of his time. He, like most white Americans of his era, saw the continent as their birthright and viewed Native Americans as a savage problem to be managed. This support for a policy that culminated in the forced march of thousands of men, women, and children on the Trail of Tears, a journey of immense suffering and death, stands as a profound and indelible stain on his legacy, a stark reminder that even men of great principle and discipline can be blinded by the prejudices of their age. Through these titanic struggles, Polk's star within the Democratic Party continued to rise. His tireless work, his mastery of the complex rules of the House, and his unshakable loyalty to the Jacksonian cause made him a natural leader. In 1835, his colleagues recognized his contributions by electing him Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful and demanding positions in the American government. At the age of 40, he had reached the pinnacle of his legislative career. The speakership, however, would be no easy reward. It would be the most difficult and thankless job he had ever undertaken. He presided over a house that was becoming increasingly unruly and polarized. The sessions were often long, chaotic, and punctuated by bitter personal insults and even the occasional threat of physical violence. Polk's approach to the speakership was the same as his approach to everything else. He mastered the job through discipline and hard work. He was known for his impartiality in his rulings, a trait that even his opponents grudgingly acknowledged. But he was also a fiercely partisan Democrat, and he used the power of the Speaker's chair to advance his party's agenda whenever possible. His most persistent and brilliant antagonist on the House floor was, ironically, the former President John Quincy Adams. After his defeat in 1828, Adams had been elected to the House of Representatives from Massachusetts, and he had transformed himself into a tenacious and brilliant champion of the anti-slavery cause. He waged a relentless one-man campaign against the so-called gag rule, a controversial House resolution that automatically tabled any petitions related to the abolition of slavery. Speaker Polk was charged with enforcing this rule, and for years the two men engaged in a legendary parliamentary duel. Adams, with his encyclopedic knowledge of the rules and his biting wit, would constantly find clever new ways to introduce the forbidden topic, while Polk, with his own deep knowledge of procedure, would just as consistently rule him out of order. Their exchanges were a fascinating spectacle, a clash between two of the most formidable intellects of their generation, and a preview of the great national conflict over slavery that was to come. After 4 years in the Speaker's chair and 14 years in Congress, Polk was weary of the constant conflict and the partisan grind of Washington. In 1839, he answered the call of his party and returned to Tennessee to run for governor. The Democrats were in danger of losing control of the state to the ascendant Whig Party, and Polk, as the state's most prominent Democrat, was seen as their only hope. He threw himself into the campaign with his customary energy, crisscrossing the state on horseback, engaging in a series of grueling debates with his Whig opponent. He won the election, a testament to his enduring popularity in his home state. His single term as governor was largely successful, but he was swimming against a powerful national tide. The financial panic of 1837 had plunged the country into a deep economic depression, and the Democratic president, Martin Van Buren, was widely blamed. In 1840, the Whigs, with their log cabin and hard cider campaign, swept the nation, and their candidate, William Henry Harrison, won the presidency. The Whig momentum carried over into state elections, and in 1841, when Polk ran for re-election as governor, he was narrowly defeated. Undeterred, he ran again in 1843, only to be defeated a second time. To the political world, it seemed that James K. Polk's career was over. He was a two-time loser, a politician whose brand of doctrinaire Jacksonianism seemed to be falling out of favor. He returned to his law practice in Columbia, Tennessee, seemingly destined to fade into political obscurity. He was respected for his past service, but no one saw him as a figure of national importance anymore. But Polk himself did not see it that way. Beneath his quiet exterior, the fire of his ambition still burned as brightly as ever. He was a patient, methodical man, and he knew that in the turbulent world of American politics, fortunes could change in an instant. He began to set his sights on the vice presidential nomination in 1844, a respectable capstone to a long career in public service. No one, not even Polk himself, could have imagined the astonishing turn of events that would, in the space of a few chaotic days, propel him from the political wilderness to the very threshold of the White House. The stage was being set for the greatest political surprise in a generation. By the end of 1843, The book on James K. Polk's political career seemed to be definitively closed. He was a man adrift, a two-time loser in his home state of Tennessee, cast out into the political wilderness. The grand narrative of American politics appeared to be moving on without him. The nation was hurtling towards the presidential election of 1844, and the stage was seemingly set for a titanic clash between two of the era's most celebrated figures, the shrewd and wily Martin Van Buren, the former president seeking to reclaim his office for the Democrats, and the brilliant, charismatic, and perennially ambitious Henry Clay, the undisputed patriarch of the Whig Party. In this drama of giants, Polk was, at best, a footnote, a respectable but faded figure from a bygone Jacksonian era. He still harbored ambitions, of course. The fire that had been stoked in his youth had never been extinguished, but they were now scaled back, tempered by the harsh reality of his recent defeats. He set his sights on the vice presidency, a dignified end to a long and honorable, if ultimately unfulfilled, career in public service. No one, not his allies, not his enemies, and certainly not the American public, could have possibly foreseen the political earthquake that was about to occur. The nation was about to learn a lesson that would echo through its history. Never underestimate the quiet, methodical man who has done his homework. To understand the shocking series of events that would pluck Polk from obscurity and place him in the presidency, we must first understand the single explosive issue that had come to dominate American politics, an issue that crackled with the static electricity of an approaching storm: Texas. The Republic of Texas, with its vast, fertile lands, had been an independent nation since 1836, a nation populated largely by American expatriates, many of whom were slaveholders. For years, the question of its annexation into the United States had simmered on the political back burner, but now it had boiled over. Annexation was not simply a matter of acquiring new territory. It was a referendum on the very future of the American Republic. To annex Texas would be to add a colossal new slave state to the Union, drastically shifting the delicate and increasingly fragile balance of power between the free soil North and the slaveholding South. It was an issue that touched upon the nation's deepest anxieties about slavery, expansion, and national identity. And it was an issue that would prove to be a fatal trap for the political titans who believed the presidency was their birthright. Martin Van Buren, the little magician from New York, was the undisputed frontrunner for the Democratic nomination. He was a master political strategist, the architect of the Democratic Party machine, and he enjoyed the widespread support of the party's old Jacksonian establishment. But he had a fatal vulnerability. He was a Northerner, and he was deeply wary of the Texas issue. He feared correctly that immediate annexation would not only provoke a war with Mexico, which still considered Texas a rebellious province, but would also tear the Democratic Party apart along sectional lines. In April 1844, in a carefully reasoned public letter, he came out against the immediate annexation of Texas. It was a principled stand, born of a desire to preserve the Union and the unity of his party. It was also a catastrophic political miscalculation. The letter was a declaration of war against the powerful pro-annexation wing of the party, a faction dominated by fiery Southern expansionists who saw the acquisition of Texas as a vital necessity for the protection and expansion of the institution of slavery. In their eyes, Van Buren's caution was an unforgivable betrayal. Henry Clay, the great Kentuckian and presumptive Whig nominee, found himself in a similar bind. As a slaveholder from a border state, he was expected to support annexation, but his Whig party was a fragile coalition of Southern cotton planters, and northern, often anti-slavery industrialists and reformers. To maintain this coalition, he needed to find a middle ground. Like Van Buren, he published a letter, the infamous Raleigh Letter, in which he attempted to do just that. He expressed his personal opposition to annexation at the present time, arguing that it would provoke a dishonorable war and threaten national unity. But he left the door open to the possibility of future annexation under different circumstances. He was trying to be all things to all people, to finesse an issue that could not be finessed. His calculated ambiguity would come to be seen not as statesmanship, but as a fatal equivocation, a sign of weakness and indecision that would ultimately doom his campaign. As the political giants stumbled, the pro-annexation forces within the Democratic Party mobilized. They were determined to stop Van Buren at all costs. Their champion was Lewis Cass of Michigan, a staunch expansionist and former Secretary of War under Jackson. But their most effective weapon was not a candidate, it was a procedural rule. As the delegates began to gather in Baltimore in late May of 1844 for the Democratic National Convention, the Southern-led expansionists succeeded in getting the convention to adopt the two-thirds rule, a requirement that the eventual nominee must secure the votes of a full two-thirds of the delegates, not a simple majority. This was a master stroke of political hardball, a rule aimed squarely at Van Buren. His opponents knew that he had enough support to win a majority, but they were equally certain that he could never muster the two-thirds supermajority required for the nomination. The rule was a procedural guillotine designed to sever the head of the party's leading candidate. The convention opened in a scene of barely controlled chaos. Baltimore was sweltering in the late spring heat, and the atmosphere inside the convention hall was equally oppressive. Hundreds of delegates, journalists, and spectators were packed into the Egyptian saloon of the Odd Fellows Hall, a space utterly inadequate for the occasion. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, tobacco smoke, and cheap whiskey. Factions caucused in stuffy hotel rooms, and rumors swirled like the humid air itself. On the first ballot, the result was exactly as predicted. Van Buren won a clear majority, but fell short of the required two-thirds. The hall erupted. Ballot after ballot, the scene repeated itself. Van Buren's support slowly began to bleed away while Lewis Cass's numbers crept upwards. But Cass, too, could not reach the magic number. The convention was deadlocked, paralyzed by its own internal divisions. The delegates grew weary, the speeches became more strident, and the mood turned desperate. The great Democratic Party, the party of Jackson, seemed to be on the verge of self-immolation. It was in this moment of crisis and desperation that a new name began to be whispered through the crowded hall, a name that was not on anyone's list of serious contenders, James K. Polk. Polk had come to the convention with no expectation of being the presidential nominee. He was there to lobby for the vice presidential slot. But his small team of loyalists, led by his old friend Gideon Pillow and the historian George Bancroft, saw an opportunity in the chaos. As the convention stalled, they began to work the floor, quietly suggesting to the weary and frustrated delegates that Polk was the perfect compromise candidate. He was a Southerner and a staunch Jacksonian. He was a protege of Old Hickory himself. And most importantly, he was an ardent and unapologetic supporter of the immediate annexation of Texas. He was, in short, everything the Southern delegates wanted, but he was not so prominent as to have made the powerful enemies that plagued a candidate like Cass. He was the ideal dark horse. On the 8th ballot, the strategy was put into motion. A delegate from New Hampshire cast his state's votes for Polk. The result was underwhelming. He received only a handful of votes. It seemed like a failed gambit, but overnight the tide began to turn. The key was the New York delegation. Though loyal to their native son Van Buren, they could see that his cause was lost. Desperate to prevent the nomination of their rival, Lewis Cass, they began to look for an alternative. In a series of tense late-night meetings, they were persuaded that Polk was the only candidate who could unite the party. When the convention reconvened the next morning, the ninth ballot began. State after state, in a stunning and dramatic cascade, abandoned their previous candidates and threw their support to the man from Tennessee. The hall, which had been a bedlam of competing factions, was suddenly swept up in a wave of unity. The Virginia delegation, which had been staunchly for Van Buren, switched to Polk, and the stampede was on. The final result was breathtaking. James K. Polk, the man who had lost 2 consecutive elections for governor, the man whose career was thought to be over, was declared the unanimous nominee of the Democratic Party for President of the United States. The news was met with widespread astonishment, and among the Whigs, with derision. "Who is James K. Polk?" they famously sneered in their newspapers, a slogan designed to highlight his relative obscurity and to mock the Democrats for nominating a provincial unknown over their party's established leaders. It was a question that echoed across the nation, but the Democrats, with Polk's quiet and methodical guidance, brilliantly turned the question on its head. They embraced his obscurity, portraying him as a humble, unassuming man of the people, a true heir to the Jacksonian tradition, in stark contrast to the Whig nominee, the lordly and supposedly out-of-touch Henry Clay. The Democratic platform was a model of political genius. It was clear, concise, and masterfully crafted to appeal to the expansionist mood of the country. It cleverly yoked the 2 great territorial questions of the day into a single irresistible package. It called for the re-annexation of Texas, a phrase that cleverly implied that Texas had always rightfully belonged to the U.S. since the Louisiana Purchase, thus appealing to Southern desires. And in the very same sentence, it called for the reoccupation of Oregon, asserting the American claim to the entire Oregon Territory, which was then jointly occupied with Great Britain. This demand was encapsulated in the electrifying and alliterative slogan, 54-40 or fight, a reference to the northern latitude of the Oregon claim. This brilliant piece of political triangulation allowed the Democrats to appeal to both Southern slaveholders and the expansionist farmers and merchants of the North and West. They were the party of manifest destiny, the party that would make America a continental empire. While his surrogates crisscrossed the country delivering fiery speeches, Polk himself conducted a masterful front porch campaign from his home in Columbia, Tennessee. He understood that the image of a quiet, dignified statesman was more effective than that of a grasping, office-seeking politician. He rarely made public appearances, instead managing his campaign through a relentless torrent of correspondence. Day and night he sat at his desk, drafting letters to party leaders in every state, coordinating strategy, soothing ruffled feathers, and ensuring that the party maintained a united front. His most brilliant strategic move was his public pledge, made at the very start of the campaign, to serve only 1 term if elected. This was an act of political self-denial that was almost unheard of. It immediately diffused the ambitions of his potential rivals within the party, assuring them that they would have their own chance in 4 years. More importantly, it presented him to the public as a man of principle, a selfless patriot who sought the presidency not for personal glory, but to achieve a set of clear, concrete goals for the nation. In contrast to Polk's disciplined and focused campaign, Henry Clay's campaign was a study in indecision. Trapped by his own cleverness, he continued to waffle on the Texas issue, Fearing he was losing support in the South, he issued a series of public letters, the Alabama letters, in which he seemed to soften his opposition to annexation. This clumsy attempt to placate the South had the opposite effect. It alienated his anti-slavery supporters in the North without fully satisfying the pro-annexation forces in the South. He looked like a man who was willing to say anything to get elected, a stark contrast to the clear, unwavering position of his Democratic opponent. The election in November was a nail-biter. The popular vote was incredibly close, with Polk winning by a slim margin of less than 40,000 votes out of nearly 2.7 million cast. The election ultimately hinged on the outcome in a single state, New York. And it was here that the final delicious irony of the campaign played out. The state was a Whig stronghold, and Clay was expected to win it easily. But a third party had entered the fray, the Abolitionist Liberty Party, led by James G. Birney. The Liberty Party had no chance of winning, but its platform of uncompromising opposition to slavery appealed to a small but significant number of anti-slavery Whigs who were disgusted by Clay's waffling on Texas. In the final tally, Birney received just over 15,000 votes in New York. Clay lost the state to Polk by a mere 5,000 votes. Had even a third of those Liberty Party voters held their noses and voted for Clay, he would have won New York and the presidency. In one of history's great paradoxes, the very party that was dedicated to the destruction of slavery had inadvertently tipped the election to a slaveholder who was committed to annexing a massive new slave territory. The news of Polk's victory sent shockwaves across the nation. The Democrats were ecstatic, while the Whigs were plunged into a state of stunned disbelief. The man they had derided as a blight from the fens of Tennessee was now the president-elect. Polk received the news with his characteristic lack of outward emotion, but in private, he was already hard at work. He immediately began the process of selecting his cabinet, choosing men of ability, but ensuring that none were so powerful as to challenge his own authority. He reaffirmed his four great goals for his single term in office: to settle the Oregon boundary dispute with Great Britain, to acquire California from Mexico, to lower the protective tariff, and to reestablish an independent national treasury. He was a man with a plan, a clear and audacious agenda that he intended to pursue with the same relentless, methodical focus that had defined his entire life. In March 1845, James K. Polk, the most unlikely president in American history, took the oath of office, his face grim and determined, ready to unleash a storm of change that would forever alter the destiny of his nation. On the 4th of March, 1845, a cold, persistent rain fell on Washington, D.C., soaking the unpaved streets and turning the grounds of the Capitol into a sea of mud. It was a miserable, gloomy day, but the weather could not dampen the spirit of the thousands who had gathered to witness the inauguration of the nation's first ever dark horse president. They stood in a dense, dripping crowd, their umbrellas a bobbing canopy of black, to hear from the man who had emerged from the political wilderness to capture the presidency. James K. Polk, looking thin and pale but imbued with a solemn dignity, stepped onto the east portico of the Capitol. He did not shrink from the rain. He stood in the open, unprotected from the elements, and for over an hour he delivered his inaugural address, his voice steady and clear against the drumming of the downpour. The speech itself was a remarkable document. It was a clear and unapologetic manifesto of Jacksonian democracy and manifest destiny. He celebrated the virtues of a simple agrarian republic, warned against the dangers of a national bank and a high protective tariff, and then looking west, he spoke of the nation's destiny. He declared that the American title to the Oregon country was clear and unquestionable, a defiant challenge to Great Britain. He spoke of the recent vote to annex Texas, not as a matter of choice, but as a peaceful and consensual reunion. And then he made a statement that stunned the political establishment and cemented his image as a man apart from the grasping ambition that defined the capital. He publicly reaffirmed his pledge to be a one-term president, declaring, "I shall, on the 4th of March, 1849, retire to private life." It was a declaration of intent, a promise that he was not in Washington for personal glory, but to accomplish a specific set of tasks. He had a plan, and he was putting the nation and the world on notice. With the ceremony concluded, Polk moved into a White House that was a far cry from the fortress-like complex of today. It was a more open, accessible building, but Polk and his wife Sarah would transform its character entirely. Sarah, a devout Presbyterian, immediately banned hard liquor, card playing, and most famously, dancing from the executive mansion. The lavish alcohol-fueled parties of the previous administration were replaced by sober, formal receptions. The Whigs of Washington society were aghast, derisively nicknaming the new First Lady Sahara Sarah. But behind the prim exterior was a will of iron and a political mind that was every bit the equal of her husband's. Sarah Polk was not a socialite. She was her husband's chief of staff, his most intimate advisor, and his fiercest protector. She managed his schedule, curated his image, and served as the gatekeeper to the most powerful man in the country. The Polk White House became a place of relentless, almost monastic dedication to work, and no one worked harder than the president himself. James K. Polk's presidency was an astonishing and ultimately tragic testament to the limits of human endurance. He was arguably the hardest working president in American history. His daily routine was punishing. He rose before dawn and was often at his desk by 6 in the morning, working by the light of an oil lamp. His days were a relentless succession of meetings, correspondence, and detailed administrative oversight. He did not delegate, he commanded. He famously declared, "I prefer to supervise the whole operations of the government myself rather than entrust the public business to subordinates." And he meant it. He personally reviewed budget requests from every department, read through diplomatic dispatches, and even signed individual land patents. His diary, one of the most complete and revealing presidential records ever kept, paints a picture of a man utterly consumed by his job. The entries are a monotonous litany of work, a chronicle of a man who seemed to take no pleasure in the pomp and ceremony of his office. He complained constantly about the endless stream of office seekers who plagued him, calling them the most tormenting pest. He rarely took a day off, viewing vacations and leisure as a dereliction of duty. His Attorney General, Nathan Clifford, recalled that Polk was the most laborious man I have ever known, and that he works from 12 to 14 hours in every 24th. This obsessive micromanaging style extended to his cabinet. He had assembled a group of competent and experienced men, including the veteran statesman James Buchanan as Secretary of State and the brilliant financial wizard Robert J. Walker as Secretary of the Treasury. But he made it clear from the outset that there was only one man in charge. Cabinet meetings were not collaborative discussions. They were briefings in which the president would listen to reports and then issue his orders. He demanded absolute loyalty and treated any dissent as a personal affront. He was a difficult and demanding taskmaster, but his singular focus and iron discipline would enable him to achieve something that very few presidents ever have: the complete and total fulfillment of his entire campaign agenda. He began with his domestic program, the less glamorous but, in his mind, equally essential pillars of his Jacksonian faith. His first target was the nation's financial system. The Whigs, during their brief time in power, had dismantled the independent treasury system that had been established under Van Buren. This system, a cornerstone of Jacksonian economic theory, was designed to completely separate the federal government's funds from private banks. Jacksonians viewed the banking system, and particularly a national bank, as a source of corruption and instability, an institution that enriched a privileged few at the expense of the many. They believed that the government's money should be held in its own secure vaults or sub-treasuries, completely insulated from the speculative manias of the private banking world. Polk was determined to bring it back. He devoted a significant portion of his first annual message to Congress to the issue, and his Secretary of the Treasury, Robert J. Walker, followed up with a detailed and persuasive report. The Whigs fought the measure tooth and nail, arguing that it was a primitive and deflationary system that would stifle economic growth. The debate was fierce, but Polk applied relentless pressure on his fellow Democrats in Congress, using every tool of patronage and party discipline at his disposal. In August of 1846, the Independent Treasury Act was passed, a major legislative victory that would, with a few interruptions, remain the basis of the U.S. financial system until the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. 1 goal down, 3 to go. His next target was the tariff. For decades, the tariff had been one of the most divisive issues in American politics, a source of profound sectional animosity. The industrializing North, with its burgeoning factories, generally favored high protective tariffs to shield its products from foreign competition. The agricultural South, which exported most of its cotton and tobacco and imported manufactured goods, despised the tariff, viewing it as an unjust tax that raised their costs to subsidize northern industry. Polk, as a Southerner and a committed free trader, was determined to lower the rates. Once again, the architect of the policy was the indefatigable Robert J. Walker. Walker produced another landmark report, a brilliant and comprehensive argument for free trade that is still studied by economists today. He argued that the existing tariff was not only unjust, but also inefficient, and that a lower revenue-based tariff would actually stimulate trade and increase overall government receipts. The resulting legislation, which became known as the Walker Tariff of 1846, proposed a radical reduction in duties. The bill sparked another ferocious battle in Congress. It passed the House with relative ease, but in the Senate, the vote was deadlocked. The fate of the president's second major policy goal hung in the balance. The tie-breaking vote fell to the Vice President, George M. Dallas of Pennsylvania. Dallas was from a state that strongly favored a protective tariff, and he was under immense pressure from his constituents to vote no, but he was also a loyal Democrat. In a moment of high drama, he cast his vote in favor of the bill. The Walker Tariff became law. It was another stunning victory for Polk, one achieved by the slimmest of margins. He had now accomplished half of his agenda in less than 2 years. With his domestic program enacted, Polk turned his attention to the vast and daunting landscape of foreign policy, to the grand continental vision that had propelled him to the presidency. His first great challenge was to resolve the Oregon question. The vast Oregon country, a sprawling wilderness that stretched from the northern border of California to the southern border of Russian Alaska, was a prize of immense strategic and economic value. For decades, it had been jointly occupied by the United States and Great Britain, a temporary arrangement that was becoming increasingly untenable as thousands of American pioneers began to pour into the region via the Oregon Trail. The Democratic platform, in a fit of expansionist fervor, had laid claim to the entire territory, all the way to the latitude of 54 degrees 40 minutes north, under the belligerent slogan, 5440 or fight. Polk had ridden that slogan to the White House, and now the public, particularly in the western states, expected him to deliver. They were spoiling for a fight with their old colonial masters. But Polk, despite his tough public rhetoric, was a pragmatist. He knew that a war with Great Britain, the world's preeminent naval and industrial power, would be a national catastrophe. He also knew that he could not afford to fight a war on two fronts, and his sights were already firmly set on a much weaker and more tempting target, Mexico. His strategy, therefore, was a masterful and incredibly risky display of diplomatic brinksmanship. He needed to appear aggressive enough to satisfy his domestic audience, while simultaneously signaling to the British that he was willing to negotiate a reasonable compromise. He began by reasserting the American claim to the entire territory in his inaugural address and his first message to Congress, a move that delighted his supporters and alarmed the British. The negotiations, led by his Secretary of State James Buchanan and the British minister in Washington, Richard Pakenham, quickly stalled. Buchanan, a cautious and somewhat timid diplomat, urged the president to make a compromise offer. Polk, in a calculated move, reluctantly allowed Buchanan to propose a boundary at the 49th parallel, the line that now constitutes the border between the United States and Canada. When the British minister, in a fit of diplomatic pique, rejected the offer out of hand, Polk was secretly pleased. He immediately withdrew the offer and reverted to his hardline public stance, declaring that the time for compromise was over. He then upped the ante. In a bold and provocative move, he asked Congress for the authority to give Great Britain the required 1 year's notice to abrogate the Treaty of Joint Occupation. This was a high-stakes gamble. It was a clear signal to London that the United States was prepared to take sole possession of the territory, an act that could very well lead to war. The debate in Congress was intense, with the 5440 or fight faction clamoring for action. But Polk's gamble paid off. The British government, facing domestic problems and not eager for a costly war over a distant wilderness, decided that a compromise was in order. They sent word through diplomatic back channels that they were now prepared to accept a boundary at the 49th parallel. Now it was Polk who had to navigate the treacherous domestic politics of backing down. He had whipped up a nationalistic frenzy, and now he had to sell a compromise that would give the United States only half of what he had promised. He did so with another act of political shrewdness. Instead of simply accepting the British offer and signing a treaty, he took the unusual step of submitting the proposal to the Senate for its prior advice. This was a move designed to share the political responsibility, to force the Whigs and his own Democratic hardliners to go on the record. The Senate, recognizing that this was the best possible deal short of a disastrous war, voted overwhelmingly to accept the terms. The Oregon Treaty was signed in June of 1846. Without firing a shot, Polk had secured for the United States a vast and valuable new territory, including the future states of Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, as well as the magnificent deep water port of Puget Sound. It was a triumph of diplomacy, a masterclass in the art of using belligerent rhetoric to achieve peaceful ends. 3 goals down, 1 to go. But the final and most important piece of his agenda, the acquisition of California, would not be achieved through peaceful means. The path to the Pacific led through Mexico, and that path was destined to be a bloody one. The immediate cause of the conflict was the annexation of Texas. The Mexican government had never recognized the independence of its breakaway province, and it viewed the American annexation as an act of naked aggression, a declaration of war in all but name. Diplomatic relations were severed, and the two nations stood on the brink of conflict. The key point of contention was the border. Mexico had always maintained that the southern border of Texas was the Nueces River. Texas, and now the United States, insisted that the border was the Rio Grande, a river that lay over 100 miles to the south. The territory between the two rivers was a vast, arid, and sparsely populated region, but it now became the flashpoint for a continental war. Polk was determined to acquire not just the disputed territory in Texas, but the entire Mexican province of Alta California and the vast lands of New Mexico. He saw California, with its magnificent harbors in San Francisco and San Diego, as the key to America's future as a Pacific power, a gateway to the lucrative trade of Asia. His first move was to try and buy the territory. In late 1845, he dispatched a secret envoy, John Slidell, to Mexico City with a bold and, in retrospect, wildly optimistic offer. Slidell was authorized to offer the Mexican government the assumption of several $1 million in unpaid claims owed to American citizens in exchange for recognition of the Rio Grande border. More audaciously, he was authorized to offer up to $25 million for the provinces of New Mexico and California. The mission was a complete and utter failure. The Mexican government, in a state of political turmoil and besieged by a hyper-nationalistic press, was in no position to sell off half of its country. To even receive an American envoy to discuss such a humiliating proposal would have been political suicide. Slidell was rebuffed, unable to even present his credentials. When news of the mission's failure reached Washington in early 1846, Polk's mind turned from diplomacy to war. He was a man who did not tolerate failure, and he now believed that force was the only language the Mexicans would understand. He had a second strategy, a darker and more provocative one, already in motion. Months earlier, he had ordered a small American army under the command of General Zachary Taylor to take up a position at Corpus Christi on the banks of the Nueces River. Now, with Slidell's rejection in hand, Polk made his fateful decision. On January 13, 1846, he sent a direct order to General Taylor: advance your army from the Nueces to the northern bank of the Rio Grande. This was not a defensive maneuver. It was a deliberate, calculated act of aggression, a decision to march American troops into territory that was, by any reasonable interpretation, disputed. It was the equivalent of poking a hornet's nest with a very large stick. Taylor, a rough-hewn but capable soldier, obeyed his orders. In March, his army of some 4,000 men arrived on the banks of the Rio Grande, directly across from the Mexican town of Matamoros. They began to build a fort, their cannons aimed directly at the town square. The Mexican commander, viewing this as an invasion of his homeland, responded by moving his own troops across the river. For several tense weeks, the two armies faced each other across the muddy waters of the Rio Grande in a nervous, high-stakes standoff. The first shot, when it came, seemed almost inevitable. On April 25, 1846, a Mexican cavalry force crossed the river and ambushed a patrol of 63 American dragoons, killing 11, wounding 6, and capturing the rest. When the news of the skirmish finally reached Washington 2 weeks later on a Saturday evening, Polk had the casus belli he had been waiting for. He had, in fact, already been working with his cabinet all day on a war message to Congress, one based on Mexico's unpaid debts and its insulting rejection of his diplomat. The news of the attack gave him something far more powerful, a simple, visceral, and politically explosive narrative. He immediately convened his cabinet, and working late into the night and all the next day, he drafted one of the most effective and controversial war messages in American history. On Monday, May 11th, he sent the message to Congress. Its most famous and powerful lines were a masterpiece of political rhetoric. Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon the American soil. The message electrified Congress and the nation. The debate was brief but furious. A small number of anti-slavery Whigs, including a lanky, unknown freshman congressman from Illinois named Abraham Lincoln, questioned the president's account, demanding to know the exact spot on American soil where blood had been shed. But their voices were drowned out by a wave of patriotic outrage. The honor of the nation had been challenged, American soldiers had been killed, and the call for war was overwhelming. 2 days later, on May 13, 1846, Congress voted to declare war on Mexico. James K. Polk, the quiet man from Tennessee, had, through a masterful combination of diplomacy, patience, and deliberate provocation, achieved his final and most audacious goal. He now had the war he needed to seize California and to complete once and for all his grand and uncompromising vision of America's manifest destiny. The nation was now on a path from which there could be no turning back. On May 13, 1846, when President James K. Polk signed the declaration of war against Mexico, the United States was embarking on its first major foreign conflict as a nation. It was a monumental gamble, a war of choice predicated on a president's unbending will to achieve his continental vision. Polk was confident, almost hubristically so. He believed the war would be short and decisive. He envisioned a swift campaign in which the superior American forces would deliver a few sharp blows, compelling the weak and politically unstable Mexican government to sue for peace and relinquish its northern provinces. He had no desire to conquer and occupy all of Mexico. He simply wanted to seize the territory he had failed to buy. But war, once unleashed, is a wild and unpredictable force. It respects neither timetables nor political agendas. The conflict that Polk believed would last a few months would stretch into nearly 2 years of brutal fighting, costing thousands of lives and exposing the deep festering wounds within his own country. From his command post in the White House, Polk, the meticulous micromanager, devised the initial war strategy himself. It was a bold, three-pronged plan designed to seize and hold all the territory he coveted. The first and largest prong was an invasion of northern Mexico, led by the hero of the Rio Grande skirmishes, General Zachary Taylor. Taylor's army of occupation was tasked with crossing the Rio Grande, defeating the main Mexican forces in the region, and securing the northern provinces. The second prong was a daring overland expedition to be led by Colonel Stephen W. Kearny. Kearny's Army of the West would march from Fort Leavenworth in Kansas across the plains to Santa Fe, seizing control of New Mexico. From there, he was ordered to proceed even further west, across the deserts, to aid in the conquest of California. The third and final prong was a naval operation. The U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, already patrolling the coast, was ordered to seize the key ports of Alta California, effectively cutting the province off from Mexico and securing it for the United States. It was an ambitious, continent-spanning strategy, and in its initial stages it would unfold with remarkable success. But from the very outset, Polk was haunted by a deep and corrosive political fear. He was a Democrat, and his two most senior and experienced generals, Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott, were both prominent and ambitious members of the opposition Whig Party. The last thing Polk wanted was to create a military hero who could ride a wave of popular acclaim into the White House in 1848, a Whig president who might dismantle his cherished Jacksonian policies. This fear, this deep-seated political paranoia, would become the defining feature of his role as commander-in-chief. He would spend the entire war engaged in a bitter, behind-the-scenes conflict with his own commanders, second-guessing their decisions, questioning their motives, and doing everything in his power to limit their fame, even at the risk of jeopardizing the military campaign itself. The first hero to emerge from the conflict was, to Polk's great chagrin, General Zachary Taylor. Taylor was the very antithesis of a spit-and-polish general. He was 61 years old, a veteran of 40 years of frontier service. He cared little for military ceremony and was famous for his sloppy, informal attire, often preferring a simple farmer's straw hat to a formal military uniform. His men adored him, affectionately calling him Old Rough and Ready. He was not a brilliant strategist or a student of military science, but he was a stubborn, tenacious fighter who exuded an aura of calm courage under fire. Immediately after the declaration of war, Taylor crossed the Rio Grande in pursuit of the Mexican army. On May 8th and 9th, 1846, on the plains near the modern-day city of Brownsville, Texas, he engaged the main Mexican force in the first two major battles of the war, Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. In both engagements, Taylor's smaller but better equipped and better led army won decisive victories, shattering the Mexican force and driving it back from the border in a disorganized retreat. The news of these victories electrified the nation. Overnight, Old Rough and Ready became a household name, the hero the country had been yearning for. Polk was pleased with the victories, but deeply uneasy about the man who had won them. Following his initial successes, Taylor pushed deeper into Mexico, his objective the heavily fortified city of Monterrey, a key strategic hub in northern Mexico. In late September, after a grueling march through the parched landscape, his army of 6,000 men arrived before the city. The battle for Monterrey was a brutal, bloody affair. For 3 days, American soldiers engaged in vicious street-to-street fighting, battling their way through fortified houses and up to the city's central plaza. The fighting was savage, with heavy casualties on both sides. Finally, on the third day, the Mexican commander, his position untenable, offered to surrender. It was here that Taylor made a decision that would infuriate the president. Instead of demanding an unconditional surrender, which would have meant taking the entire Mexican army prisoner, Taylor, citing his own heavy losses and a lack of supplies, granted the Mexican army a generous armistice. He allowed the defeated soldiers to march out of the city with their honor intact, taking their weapons and a single battery of artillery with them, in exchange for the surrender of the city and an agreement to an 8-week cessation of hostilities. To Taylor, it was a practical, soldierly decision, a way to secure his objective without further bloodshed. When news of the armistice reached Washington weeks later, Polk erupted in a volcanic fury. He convened an emergency cabinet meeting and, in the pages of his diary, excoriated his general. He saw the armistice not as a practical military decision, but as a politically motivated act of defiance, a Whig general deliberately undermining his Democratic administration's policy of prosecuting a hard, aggressive war. He was convinced that Taylor had let the enemy army escape to fight another day, thereby prolonging the war and embarrassing the president. In directing the terms of the capitulation, Polk fumed in his diary, General Taylor has acted in violation of his express orders. It is a source of deep mortification and regret. He immediately ordered the armistice to be terminated and resolved to sideline his newfound political rival. In a move that was both punitive and strategically risky, Polk decided to strip Taylor's army of the majority of its veteran troops and reassign them to a new second invasion force being assembled for a direct assault on the Mexican capital. He would leave Old Rough and Ready with a small skeletal force hoping to starve him of any further opportunity for glory. This decision would prove to be one of the greatest miscalculations of Polk's presidency, and it would nearly lead to a military catastrophe. For at that very moment, the mercurial and opportunistic Mexican general, Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, was assembling a massive new army. Santa Anna, who had been living in exile in Cuba, had cleverly duped Polk into granting him safe passage back to Mexico, promising that he would negotiate a peace treaty. Once back in his homeland, he promptly double-crossed the American president, seized power, and raised an army of 20,000 men. When his spies informed him that Taylor's force at Monterrey had been gutted, he saw his chance. He force-marched his huge army north across hundreds of miles of brutal desert, determined to surprise and annihilate the weakened American force. In February of 1847, near a mountain pass called Buena Vista, Santa Anna's massive army fell upon Taylor's small, beleaguered force of less than 5,000 men. The battle that followed was one of the most desperate and dramatic in American military history. For 2 long, bloody days, the vastly outnumbered American army was pushed to the very brink of destruction. The Mexican attacks were relentless, and at several points, the American lines buckled and nearly broke. But the American soldiers, particularly the highly effective light artillery, fought with incredible tenacity. Taylor himself, utterly fearless, sat calmly on his horse, Old Whitey, amidst a hail of bullets, directing the defense. In a legendary moment when one of his artillery captains was being overrun, he sent a simple, desperate message. "A little more grape, Captain Bragg." In the end, the American lines held. Santa Anna, his army battered and exhausted, was forced to retreat. Taylor had won a stunning, almost miraculous victory against overwhelming odds. The news of Buena Vista set off a wave of national celebration. Polk, in his attempt to sideline his rival, had inadvertently created a political colossus. Zachary Taylor, the hero of Buena Vista, was now the front-runner for the Whig presidential nomination in 1848. The president's worst fears had been fully and spectacularly realized. While Taylor was fighting in northern Mexico, the other prongs of Polk's strategy were unfolding across the vast western half of the continent. In June of 1846, Colonel Stephen W. Kearny and his Army of the West, a force of some 1,700 men, set out from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, on an epic 800-mile march to Santa Fe. After a grueling 2-month trek across the plains, they arrived in New Mexico to find that the provincial governor had fled. On August 18th, Kearny captured the ancient city of Santa Fe, the capital of New Mexico, without firing a single shot. He established a temporary civil government and, in a single bloodless campaign, had seized a vast new territory for the United States. Further west in California, events were moving even more quickly. For years, a small but growing number of American trappers, traders, and settlers had been filtering into the remote and sparsely governed Mexican province. In the summer of 1846, encouraged by the shadowy and ambitious U.S. Army, Captain John C. Fremont, a group of these settlers launched a preemptive rebellion, declaring California an independent republic in what became known as the Bear Flag Revolt. Almost simultaneously, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, under the command of Commodore John D. Sloat, sailed into Monterey Bay and raised the American flag, formally claiming California for the United States. A few weeks later, Sloat's successor, the more aggressive Robert F. Stockton, captured Los Angeles, and the initial conquest of California seemed complete. But the conquest was not yet secure. After establishing his government in Santa Fe, Colonel Kearny, following his orders, set out with a small contingent of dragoons on the even more arduous journey across the desert to California. When he arrived in December, he was met not with a peaceful province, but with a full-blown insurrection. The Californios, the native Mexican residents, had risen up against the often arrogant American occupiers and had retaken Los Angeles. Kearny's weary and exhausted force was immediately attacked by a group of Californio lancers at the Battle of San Pasqual, a bloody and inconclusive fight that left 18 of Kearny's men dead. The situation in California devolved into a chaotic power struggle, a comical but dangerous clash of egos between the three American commanders, Kearny, Stockton, and Fremont, each of whom claimed ultimate authority. It would take months of further fighting before the American control of California was finally and definitively secured. Back in Washington, as the war dragged on and the casualty list grew longer, a powerful and vocal opposition movement began to emerge. The war was deeply unpopular in New England, where anti-slavery sentiment was strongest. Abolitionists and anti-slavery Whigs denounced the conflict as Mr. Polk's War, a cynical and immoral war of conquest designed for the sole purpose of acquiring new territory for the expansion of slavery. The war, they argued, was not about defending American honor. It was about strengthening the power of the Southern slaveocracy. This opposition found its voice on the floor of Congress in August of 1846, during a debate over an appropriations bill to fund the war. A little-known Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania, David Wilmot, attached a simple but explosive amendment to the bill. This amendment, which would become known as the Wilmot Proviso, stipulated that slavery should be forever banned from any territory acquired from Mexico as a result of the war. The Wilmot Proviso was a political bombshell. It passed the House of Representatives, where the more populous North held a majority, but was blocked in the Senate, where the South had equal power. Though it never became law, the proviso fundamentally and irrevocably transformed the political landscape. It shattered the old party system, which had been based on economic issues, and redrew the lines of political conflict along a stark sectional divide. From that moment on, every debate about westward expansion would become a debate about the future of slavery. The proviso exposed the raw, irreconcilable differences between the North and the South, and it lit the fuse on a powder keg that would, a little more than a decade later, explode into the Civil War. By the end of 1846, Polk found himself in a deeply frustrating position. His armies had won every major battle and had seized all the territory he had initially set out to conquer. Yet the war was no closer to being over. The Mexican government, despite its repeated defeats, refused to surrender, refused to negotiate. Polk had a wolf by the ears, and he could neither hold on nor let go. Frustrated with Taylor's stalemate in the North and recognizing that a new strategy was needed, he reluctantly gave his approval to a daring and incredibly risky plan that had been championed by the Army's commanding general, Winfield Scott. The plan called for a massive amphibious invasion of central Mexico, a landing at the port city of Veracruz, to be followed by a 250-mile march inland to capture the enemy capital, Mexico City itself. It was a plan modeled on Cortez's conquest of the Aztecs, a high-stakes gamble that would either win the war in a single brilliant stroke or lead to a national disaster. The man chosen to lead this audacious expedition was, to Polk's immense displeasure, General Winfield Scott. Scott was, In every way, the polar opposite of Zachary Taylor. He was known as Old Fuss and Feathers for his elaborate, perfectly tailored uniforms and his strict adherence to military protocol. He was a brilliant student of military history, a meticulous planner, and a superb strategist. He was also vain, arrogant, and most damningly in Polk's eyes, a Whig with transparent presidential ambitions. Polk despised and distrusted Scott even more than he did Taylor, but he was trapped. Scott was the Army's senior general, and he was the only man with the skill and experience to command such a complex and perilous operation. In a series of tense and acrimonious meetings, Polk, swallowing his deep personal and political misgivings, authorized the expedition and placed his greatest political rival in command. In the early months of 1847, a massive American armada assembled in the Gulf of Mexico, preparing to launch the largest amphibious assault in the nation's history up to that time. The fate of the war and of Polk's presidency now rested in the hands of a man he utterly loathed. By the dawn of 1847, the Mexican-American War had reached a frustrating and bloody stalemate. President Polk's armies had achieved a string of stunning victories, seizing control of New Mexico, California, and all of northern Mexico. Yet the war was no closer to a conclusion. The Mexican government, a chaotic revolving door of presidents and generals, stubbornly refused to admit defeat, refused to enter into negotiations to sell the territories that Polk so desperately coveted. The president, a man accustomed to achieving his goals with ruthless efficiency, found himself mired in a conflict that was costing more in blood and treasure than he had ever anticipated. Worse still, the war was creating political rivals. Whig generals like Zachary Taylor, whose popularity now threatened the future of his Democratic Party. Trapped and frustrated, Polk made the riskiest decision of his presidency. He authorized a second, even more audacious invasion, a plan to strike at the very heart of the enemy to capture Mexico City itself. It was a monumental gamble, and he was forced to entrust it to the one man in America he arguably despised and distrusted more than any other, General Winfield Scott. Winfield Scott was the very picture of a commanding general. He was 6 feet 5 inches tall, a towering and imposing figure who was always impeccably dressed in a magnificent gold-braided uniform. He was known throughout the Army as Old Fuss and Feathers for his strict, almost obsessive adherence to military regulations and his notoriously pompous and vain demeanor. But beneath the flamboyant exterior was one of the finest military minds America had ever produced. He was a deep student of European warfare, a brilliant strategist, and a meticulous logistical planner. While Zachary Taylor won battles through stubborn courage, Scott won them through careful preparation and tactical brilliance. He was, in short, the perfect general to lead the most complex and dangerous military operation in the nation's young history. In early March 1847, a massive American armada, an unprecedented fleet of over 100 ships, appeared off the coast of the fortified port city of Veracruz. On board was Scott's army of 12,000 men. On the evening of March 9th, in a flawlessly executed operation, Scott landed his entire army on the beaches south of the city without a single casualty. It was the first major amphibious assault in American history, and it was a stunning success. For the next 20 days, the Americans besieged Veracruz, their heavy siege cannons, brilliantly placed by a group of talented young engineering officers, including Captain Robert E. Lee, relentlessly pounding the city's defenses. On March 29th, Veracruz surrendered. The gateway to central Mexico was now open. But the most perilous part of the journey was still ahead. Scott's objective, Mexico City, lay 250 miles to the west, over a formidable mountain range and deep within enemy territory. His army was small, and it would be operating with a long and vulnerable supply line, constantly harassed by Mexican guerrillas. Worse still, he was marching into the heart of the Tierra Caliente, the hot country, where the dreaded yellow fever, known locally as El Vomito, was rampant. He knew he had to move his army quickly into the cooler, healthier highlands or risk losing it to disease. His old nemesis, General Santa Anna, was waiting for him. After his defeat at Buena Vista, Santa Anna had raced south and, with incredible speed, had assembled a new army. He had taken up a heavily fortified position in a mountain pass at Cerro Gordo, a position he believed was impregnable. He boasted that he would not lose a single man and would drive the American invaders into the sea. But he had not accounted for the brilliance of Scott's engineers. Captain Robert E. Lee, on a daring reconnaissance mission, discovered a rough, little-known track that would allow the American army to bypass the main Mexican defenses and achieve a complete flanking of the enemy position. On April 18th, Scott's army struck. The Battle of Cerro Gordo was a tactical masterpiece. The Americans swarmed the Mexican positions from the front and the rear, and in a few short hours, Santa Anna's army was completely routed. Santa Anna himself barely escaped, leaving behind his personal carriage, his cork leg, and a chest containing thousands of dollars in gold. The road to the Central Plateau and to Mexico City now lay open. While Scott's army was achieving these stunning military successes, another more peculiar drama was unfolding within the American camp. President Polk, his paranoia about his Whig generals unabated, had decided he could not trust Scott to negotiate a peace treaty that would serve the administration's interests. So, in a highly unusual and unorthodox move, he had dispatched a civilian diplomat, the chief clerk of the State Department, Nicholas Trist, to travel with Scott's army. Trist was a strange choice for such a delicate mission. He was a pedantic, self-important, and notoriously long-winded bureaucrat, but he was also a loyal Democrat, married to the granddaughter of Thomas Jefferson, and Polk trusted him. He was given the full powers of a peace commissioner, authorized to suspend military operations and negotiate a treaty the moment the Mexican government showed any willingness to talk. The arrangement was a recipe for disaster. Scott, a man of immense pride and vanity, was deeply insulted that a mere State Department clerk had been given the authority to halt his military campaign. He saw it as a direct challenge to his authority, another example of the president's politically motivated meddling. When Trist arrived in Mexico, his initial interactions with the general were comically hostile. The two men, both proud and thin-skinned, immediately took a deep and abiding dislike to one another. For weeks they refused to speak, communicating only through a series of increasingly vitriolic and insulting letters, a bizarre spectacle that unfolded as their army marched deeper into enemy territory. It was only through the quiet diplomacy of their subordinates that the two men were finally brought together, and they soon discovered that they actually shared a common goal: to end the war on honorable terms. They would go on to form a surprisingly effective, if unlikely, partnership. By mid-August, after a series of hard-fought victories at the battles of Contreras and Churubusco, on the immediate outskirts of Mexico City, Scott's army stood at the gates of the capital. The Mexican army was battered, but not yet broken. At this crucial moment, Trist informed Scott that he had received peace feelers from the enemy. Believing that a final bloody assault on the city could be avoided, Scott agreed to an armistice to allow for negotiations. For 2 weeks, Trist met with Mexican commissioners, attempting to hammer out a treaty based on Polk's original instructions. But back in Washington, the news of the armistice sent the president into yet another paroxysm of rage. He saw it as a replay of Taylor's mistake at Monterrey, a foolish and naive decision to trust the treacherous Mexicans, who were clearly just using the ceasefire to regroup and strengthen their defenses. He was also, by this point, coming under increasing pressure from a new and radical faction within his own party. The stunning success of his armies had given rise to the All of Mexico movement, a group of expansionists who were no longer content with just California and New Mexico. They were now clamoring for the annexation of all of Mexico, the absorption of its entire territory and population into the United States. Polk, though tempted, recognized that such a move would be a political, cultural, and military catastrophe. Frustrated with the lack of progress and furious at what he perceived as the insubordination of his general and his diplomat, Polk made a rash decision. On October 6, 1847, he sent a dispatch to Mexico containing a direct and unequivocal order. Nicholas Trist was to be recalled, his mission terminated. He was to return to Washington immediately. The window for a negotiated peace, it seemed, was about to be slammed shut by the president's own hand. By the time Polk's recall order reached Mexico, the situation had changed dramatically. The peace negotiations had failed, the armistice had collapsed, and Scott's army had resumed its offensive. On September 8th, the Americans launched an assault on a series of fortified buildings known as the Molino del Rey, in what would prove to be one of the bloodiest and least necessary battles of the war. Believing the buildings housed a cannon foundry, the Americans attacked, only to be met with ferocious resistance. They took the position, but at a cost of nearly 800 casualties, and found no cannons. The final objective was now Chapultepec Castle, a massive stone fortress that stood on a 200-foot-high hill overlooking the western approaches to Mexico City. It was the home of Mexico's military academy, and it was the last major defensive position outside the city gates. On the morning of September 13th, American artillery began a furious bombardment of the castle. Then the infantry assault began. American soldiers, carrying scaling ladders, charged up the steep slopes under a hail of musket and cannon fire. The fighting was desperate and heroic on both sides. The castle was defended by veteran soldiers and a group of young military cadets, some as young as 13. The story of these boy cadets, the Niños Héroes, would become one of Mexico's most sacred national legends. The last 6 of them are said to have fought to the death, with one, Juan Escutia, supposedly wrapping himself in the Mexican flag and leaping from the castle walls to prevent the flag from being captured. By mid-morning, the castle had fallen. The American army, exhausted and bloodied, then fought its way down the 2 causeways leading into the city, finally breaking through the San Cosme and Belén Gates. That night, Santa Anna and what was left of the Mexican army abandoned the capital. On the morning of September 14, 1847, General Winfield Scott, dressed in his finest uniform, rode in triumph into the city's grand central plaza, the Zócalo. An American flag was raised over the National Palace, the legendary halls of Montezuma. The fighting was finally over. The American army had captured the enemy capital, a stunning military achievement that had been purchased at a terrible cost. It was into this scene of victory and chaos that Polk's recall order finally arrived for Nicholas Trist. Trist found himself in an impossible position. He had been officially fired. His diplomatic authority had been revoked. His orders were to pack his bags and go home. But as he looked around the occupied city, he saw a fleeting and perhaps final opportunity for peace. The Mexican government was on the verge of complete collapse. If he left, he knew there would be no one left to negotiate with. The United States would be forced into a long, bloody, and politically toxic guerrilla war, an open-ended occupation of a hostile country. In that moment, Nicholas Trist made one of the most remarkable and audacious decisions in the history of American diplomacy. He decided to defy a direct presidential order. He sat down and penned a 65-page letter to Secretary of State James Buchanan, a masterpiece of bureaucratic insolence and patriotic conviction. He explained in excruciating detail why the president was wrong, why his recall was a catastrophic mistake, and why he, Nicholas Trist, a disgraced and fired clerk, was going to stay in Mexico and negotiate a treaty anyway. He wrote that he was prepared to be not merely disavowed, but summarily shot upon my return. Having sent his astonishing letter, Trist, now acting as a private citizen with no official authority whatsoever, reopened negotiations with a new, more moderate Mexican government that had been cobbled together in the wake of the city's fall. For weeks, he worked tirelessly, cajoling, bluffing, and persuading, and in the end, he succeeded. On February 2nd, 1848, in the suburb of Guadalupe, Hidalgo, he signed a peace treaty that was a complete and total victory for the United States. The terms were almost exactly what Polk had instructed him to get nearly a year earlier. Mexico formally ceded all of California and New Mexico, the Mexican Cession, a vast territory of over 500,000 square miles. It recognized the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. In return, the United States agreed to pay Mexico a token sum of $15 million and to assume the unpaid claims of its own citizens. When the treaty, negotiated by a renegade diplomat, arrived in Washington, Polk was faced with a profound dilemma. He was incandescent with rage at Trist's insubordination, scribbling in his diary that Trist was an arrogant, impudent, and insulting scoundrel. His first instinct was to reject the treaty out of hand and have Trist arrested, but he was trapped by his own success. The treaty gave him everything he had gone to war for. The anti-war opposition in Congress was growing stronger by the day, and the All of Mexico faction in his own party was becoming dangerously popular. The treaty was a way out, a chance to end the war and secure his prize. Swallowing his pride and privately fuming, Polk submitted the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo to the Senate. After a bitter debate, it was ratified on March 10th, 1848. The war was over. James K. Polk had achieved the fourth and final goal of his presidency. He had redrawn the map of the continent, expanding his nation's domain to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. It was a triumph of staggering proportions, a fulfillment of the promise of manifest destiny. But the glory of the victory could not hide its terrible cost. Nearly 13,000 American soldiers were dead, the vast majority of them from disease. The nation was saddled with a huge war debt, and, most ominously, the country was now more divided than ever before over the toxic, irrepressible question of whether the vast new territories, acquired with so much blood and treasure, would be lands of freedom or of slavery. The victorious president had just over a year left in his term, a year that would be consumed not by the celebration of his triumph, but by the bitter political squabbling over its consequences. The war was over. In the spring of 1848, with the ratification of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, James K. Polk had achieved the last and most difficult of his great presidential objectives. In less than 3 years, he had presided over the single greatest territorial expansion in American history, stretching his nation's domain from the plains of Texas to the sun-drenched shores of the Pacific Ocean. He had accomplished everything he had set out to do, a feat of political execution that was and remains almost without parallel. By all accounts, his final year in office should have been a victory lap, a period of national celebration and personal satisfaction. But the presidency of James K. Polk was destined to be a story devoid of easy triumphs and happy endings. The ink on the peace treaty was barely dry when the immense and dangerous consequences of his triumph came rushing back to haunt him. He would spend his last year in the White House not as a conquering hero, but as a besieged and exhausted president, watching helplessly as the very territories he had acquired began to tear his beloved country apart. Just as the war was ending, a world-changing event occurred in the remote foothills of his newly acquired province of California. In January 1848, a carpenter named James Marshall, working on a sawmill for John Sutter near the American River, noticed a few glittering flecks in the mill's tail race. It was gold. Though the news was initially suppressed, it soon leaked out, and by the end of the year, Polk himself would officially confirm the discovery in his final annual message to Congress, an announcement that would trigger a global stampede. The California gold rush of 1849 was about to begin, a chaotic, transformative event that would validate Polk's quest for the Pacific coast in the most spectacular way imaginable. But the sudden influx of hundreds of thousands of prospectors and settlers into a region with no established civil government created an immediate and desperate crisis. California needed laws. It needed order. It needed to be organized as a territory and soon a state. And that brought the nation face to face with the one question that could no longer be deferred. The one issue that Polk's territorial ambitions had pushed to the absolute forefront of American life: slavery. Would this vast new empire, this prize won with so much American blood, be an empire of freedom or an empire of slavery? The moment the war began, the Wilmot Proviso had drawn a line in the sand. And for the next several years, every debate in Congress, no matter how trivial, would devolve into a bitter, angry, and increasingly hopeless struggle over the status of slavery in the Mexican Cession. The hallowed halls of the Capitol, which Polk had once commanded with such discipline, now echoed with the furious rhetoric of sectional division. Southern leaders, like the grim ideologue John C. Calhoun, argued that it was their constitutional right to take their slave property into any commonly owned territory. Northern anti-slavery men, a growing and increasingly radicalized group, countered that the federal government had the moral and constitutional duty to prevent the spread of what they called the slave power's corrupting influence. Polk, a lifelong slaveholder himself, was caught in the middle of the firestorm he had helped to create. He watched with growing alarm as the Democratic Party, the great political vehicle of his life's work, began to fracture along a north-south divide. His solution was a pragmatic one. He sought to extend the old Missouri Compromise line, the latitude of 36 degrees 30 minutes, all the way to the Pacific Ocean, allowing slavery in the territories to the south of the line and banning it to the north. It was a simple geographical solution to a complex moral and political problem, an attempt to put the issue to rest. But the time for such compromises had passed. His proposal was rejected, satisfying neither the pro-slavery extremists of the South nor the free soil advocates of the North. Congress was deadlocked, and his final year in office was consumed by this single, intractable issue, a frustrating and impotent end to a presidency that had been defined by decisive action. True to his word, Polk refused all entreaties to run for a second term. He had made his pledge, and he was a man who kept his promises. The presidential election of 1848 thus became a bizarre and ironic spectacle for the outgoing president. The Democrats, spurning Polk's more moderate statesmanship, nominated his old rival, the staunch expansionist Lewis Cass. The Whigs, in a masterstroke of political opportunism, bypassed their own party leaders and nominated the man who was now the biggest hero in America, General Zachary Taylor. Polk was forced to watch as old Rough and Ready, the gruff, apolitical soldier whom he had so deeply distrusted and tried so hard to sideline, was swept into the presidency on a wave of popular adoration for the military victories that Polk, as commander-in-chief, had orchestrated. It was the ultimate bitter irony of his presidency. The war that was his greatest achievement had also created the political rival who would succeed him and preside over the dissolution of his party's dominance. As his term drew to a close, Polk's exhaustion was palpable to all who saw him. His diary entries from his final months in office are a poignant chronicle of a man at the absolute end of his rope, a man utterly depleted by the crushing burdens of his office. "I am heartily rejoiced that my term is so near its close," he wrote in February 1849. "I shall feel messages of relief when I am no longer responsible for the happiness and peace of the country." The physical transformation he had undergone was shocking. The man who had entered the White House 4 years earlier with dark hair and a youthful, if serious countenance was now gaunt and stooped. His hair had turned a brittle gray, his face was deeply lined, and his eyes, which had always been serious, now seemed haunted by a profound weariness. He had aged decades in 4 short years. He had literally poured his life force into the job, sacrificing his health, his peace of mind, and ultimately his future on the altar of his political agenda. His final journey home in March of 1849 was supposed to be a triumphant procession, a well-earned farewell tour, and in many ways it was. As he and Sarah traveled by steamboat and carriage down the Atlantic coast and then west through the Deep South, they were met at every stop by adoring crowds, cannon salutes, and grand balls held in their honor. The man who had been derided as an unknown just 4 years earlier was now hailed as a conquering hero, the president who had made America a continental power. But beneath the celebrations, a dark and ominous shadow was spreading across the land. Cholera, the terrifying and deadly scourge of the 19th century, was sweeping up the Mississippi Valley, leaving a trail of death and panic in its wake. In New Orleans, the epidemic was particularly virulent. Polk, his immune system already compromised by years of stress and overwork, passed directly through the afflicted city. He arrived back in Nashville in early April, a frail and exhausted man. He and Sarah moved into their new home, a handsome mansion in downtown Nashville that they had named Polk Place. It was to be their haven, the quiet retreat where he would live out his days as a respected elder statesman, organizing his voluminous presidential papers and enjoying the simple pleasures that had so long been denied him. For a few brief, fleeting weeks, it seemed as if he might get his wish. He busied himself with the methodical task of arranging his library and sorting through his papers, the final act of a man whose life had been defined by order and discipline. But he had carried a fatal passenger with him from New Orleans. In early June, he fell ill with what at first seemed to be a simple case of chronic diarrhea. But his condition quickly worsened. The dreaded symptoms of cholera appeared: violent cramps, uncontrollable vomiting, and extreme dehydration. The disease was brutal and swift. A local doctor was summoned, but the remedies of the day, laudanum and calomel, were useless. Sarah, his devoted partner, nursed him tirelessly, but he was fading fast. He was a man who had commanded armies and reshaped a continent, but he was powerless against the microscopic enemy that was now ravaging his body. Knowing the end was near, he asked to be baptized into the Methodist Church, a final concession to the faith that his mother had held so dear and that his wife had quietly practiced throughout their lives. His last days were a blur of pain and fleeting consciousness. His final coherent words were whispered to the woman who had been his partner in all things, his anchor in every storm. "I love you, Sarah," he said. "For all eternity, I love you." On the afternoon of June 15, 1849, at the age of just 53, James K. Polk died. He had been out of office for only 103 days. He holds the sad distinction of having the shortest retirement of any president, a man who achieved everything he set out to do for his country, only to be denied any personal reward, any time to savor the fruits of his monumental labors. The legacy of James K. Polk is one of the greatest paradoxes in American history. By the measure of his achievements, he was a giant. In a single term, he fulfilled every goal he set, annexing Texas, settling the Oregon question, and seizing the entire Southwest to shape the modern map of the United States. He was the president who made manifest destiny a reality. But that resounding success came at a terrible price. The vast territories he won became the battleground for the fiery debate over slavery, igniting the political flames that led directly to the bloody Civil War. He built a nation that stretched to the sea, but also sowed the seeds of a division that would nearly destroy it. Therefore, Polk's story is a tragic reminder that sometimes the price of a great victory is the peace of an entire generation.